It didn't make sense. None of it did. How on earth could M have trained the Rainbow Wizard? Sam thought as he paced the 12-foot stone room number 16 had caged him in. His first several dozen attempts to leave the room were met with immediate failure. He could open the door, yes. He could see number 16 guarding it on the right. The last dozen or so times the bastard was actually sleeping on the job. But the moment Sam attempted to leave, he would simply appear at the end of the room opposite of the door, and the door would once again be shut. The windows also wasn't an option. Not only was the tower several hundred feet tall, but a series of iron-wrought bars were so densely packed that Unity City's lights barely twinkled through. Straining to see the outsides, Sam spotted a pair of grotesque stone gargoyles chiseled into the tower's face like two of the world's most unnecessary guard dogs. He was perhaps the ugliest damsel in distress to ever be hidden away in a tower. It doesn't make sense. Sam repeated the headcaster's last words to himself again and again. And yet, the headcaster had said them, and Sam believed him. Like everyone else, Sam had studied the Evergreen casters in school. There were 13 casters based here in the US from before the Veil was put in place. Evergreen casters were supposedly so powerful that, despite the Veil obscuring their magics, they were able to maintain their immortality throughout the millennium. When the Veil shattered, they revealed themselves in spectacular fashion and helped restore order, or at least redefine it. Many went on to establish schools like Quimbleys. Others disappeared into the world. Others, like Andrew Cold, had blacker reputations. Sam and every kid above the age of 6 knew the names of every Evergreen caster by heart. M was not on that list. An idea. Perhaps the spell keeping him inside was somehow connected to the door itself. If Sam could only burst through it with his baseball bat. Thwack! The vibration from his first hit shook his bones. The door stood, immaculate. Thwack! His second hit made his teeth sting. Still, the door stood. Thwack! Thwack! Throughout Sam's life, short though it had been up until then, he had swung that baseball bat several thousand times. Every time he did, he would hear his father's voice, not M's, echoing, "Sam, you have to hit through the target, through the ball. Swing through it, Sam." Thwack! Thwack! Thwunk! That last one was different. That last hit didn't set his bones on edge. Sam stared at what happened to be his bat partially going through the door. Not in the door, as though the door finally succumbed to his battering, but through it. And now it was stuck. "Goddamn magic!" Sam muttered through clenched teeth as he tried his hardest to pull the bat from the place it had somehow phased, or merged with the door. Accepting that it had somehow merged with the door through magic seemed to do the trick, and with a final heave, Sam and the bat came loose. Falling backward with the momentum, Sam hit the ground of his cell hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Gasping and catching his breath, Sam lied there and contemplated his situation as the cold stone soothed some of his aches from the previous day. It was much more comfortable than the dumpster, at least. Sam knew he had to leave this place and find Adam and Rose. But then what? And how? And why was Sam so angry? And then it hit him. Mothman. Sam had been somewhat of an eccentric individual in Point Pleasant. On the day the Veil shattered, most survivors came out of the destruction wrought by Mothman positively hating cryptids. Sam had always been in love with them, though. It was his understanding that Mothman's presence there was merely a coincidence. He believed that it was the magic that was somehow to blame. The second appearance of Mothman made something painfully clear to Sam. Something that Adam must have figured out long ago. Something that forced Adam to dedicate himself entirely to the perfection of his casting. It's Mothman. It's always been Mothman, he thought. Clearly magic still had something to do with what happened, but so long as instruments as powerful as Mothman existed, humanity couldn't possibly be safe. While Sam could stay at Quimbleys to join whatever war effort seemed to be brewing, the other part of his plan made that an impossible consideration. It's not enough to stop Mothman. I have to put an end to the whole damn thing, he thought. I have to put the Veil back in place. If it's been done before, it can be done again. Screw all this magic shit. The world has had enough. I've had enough. I can do it. Somehow. somehow, Sam didn't think people like the headcaster would be in support of the veil returning. The cold stones at his back were definitely comfortable. Way more comfortable than any bed Sam had ever slept on. Comfortable enough not to make it worth his while to hoist himself off the floor and onto the bed immediately to his right. He felt his consciousness begin to fade as the wariness of the past day crept into his bones. And on the fringe of consciousness, right before his mind turned to the creative roads it always took before he began to dream, Sam had one last sober thought. If the past day had shown him anything, it was that Sam was woefully out of his league when it came to the powers that he had to deal with. Fine. I guess I'll actually have to learn magic then. And with the tail end of that thought leaving his mind, Sam's eyes that were fixed just under the bed began to close. That is, until they saw a book. A crimson spellbook. Sam's eyes snapped open, and with a groan he reached under the bed and unearthed M's spellbook. How it had gotten there from the headcaster's study would forever mystify Sam, for it certainly would have been under any number of powerful anti-theft spells placed by the Rainbow Wizard himself. Sam guessed two tricky old casters canceled each other out. Running his hands over the binding, for the first time Sam gave the spellbook a hard look. Blood red was certainly a more accurate way of describing its color, and beyond a single M pressed in gold on the top of the cover, the supple leather was bare. Opening it and fingering through the pages, Sam began to wonder, why had M given him an empty spellbook? The several times he had seen it throughout his childhood, the book was filled to the brim with all things arcane. Sam tried to catch a glimpse more than once, but only ever came away with a headache and a soft chuckle from M. So at some point, as recently as the previous evening when M used it to create that eldritch fire, the book had not been empty. But now, flipping through the pages, Sam saw the book was completely empty just as the headcaster had reported it. Except that it wasn't. On perhaps the 20th page that Sam turned to, images began to stain the parchment as though somebody were spilling an invisible inkwell. At first they started off indiscernible, but after several seconds they took shape. There were 3 distinct illustrations drawn in what Sam recognized to be M's hand. No words, just doodles on a page. The first illustration, which appeared to be 5 or so vertical lines bowing outward from the center, began to faintly glow. Now, Sam had never intentionally cast a spell in his life, and certainly not from a spellbook, but he had seen it done enough times that intuition drove him. As he placed his right hand hovering over the glowing bars, Sam felt a magnetic attraction that pulled his palm inward and onto the page. What followed was a sensation Sam had felt only once before when M had given him a sip of his Christmas brandy several years ago. A warm sensation that started in his chest, moved upward to his neck like hot smoke. Down his arm it went like a steam through pipes and spilled into the page. The bars on the page pulsed fiercely for a brief moment before releasing themselves from the parchment in small wisps of midnight black smoke. And as this happened, the bars that covered Sam's window bowed outward with a screech and a groan, leaving just enough space for his body to squeeze through. Grabbing his bag and sheathing his bat, Sam ran to the window, breathed in the fresh air, and gazed at the twinkling city lights beneath him. Quimbleys was asleep at this late hour. Beyond his tower's lights and several more in the dorms, the university was cast in shadow. It appeared that he and the 2 stone gargoyles flanking his windows were the only souls left watching the city, from hundreds of feet above it. Okay, now what? Sam almost laughed. He certainly didn't have enough bedspread to make a rope, and his hair was several decades away from successfully pulling off a Rapunzel. Just then, the second illustration, which appeared to be a crudely drawn feather, began to pulse a cold teal and produce a sound like 2 boulders rubbing against each other. No, that wasn't quite right. The sound of scraping rock was coming directly from his left and right, from the 2 gargoyles who were now looking at him, stone no more, and eyes glowing red. Shit. I guess that makes sense, Sam said aloud, actually laughing now. Of course the headcaster would put guards on his tower, but Sam didn't quite imagine that they would be more creative than the snoozing number 16 outside his cell door. Every tower needs its dragon, right, boys? Sam said a bit more nervously as more gargoyles crawled from around the opposite side of the tower. Okay, I get it. Let's hope this works, he thought. And with the greatest leap of faith in his life, Sam jumped out of the window while pressing firmly onto the pulsing feather, and promptly plummeted like a stone into the darkness below him. Summoning every ounce of courage in his soul not to scream, Sam closed his eyes as the warmth flowed through him once again, as his hand pressed harder and harder onto the page. And like hot air filling a balloon, Sam began to float. Except, float wasn't quite right. It was more as if he was able to redirect his falling momentum and almost surf on the air. Sam cheered as he squinted his eyes against the cold fall wind biting into his face. He was free. He was going to glide down to M Street and find a way out of the city. Hell, he might even glide right out of the city. He was going to... Sam felt something tug at his backpack. With a look of horror, Sam glanced back at the tower and was face to face with one of the gargoyles. 6 of his friends followed closely behind. The gargoyles could fly, which of course they could. The closest one, grabbing onto his backpack, screeched into Sam's face as it was illuminated by a crimson light, temporarily blinding it. It was the 3rd illustration on his page, pulsing a frantic red. Sam realized immediately what it was and punched his fist down onto the page. The pulsing sketch of a rock exploded off the parchment in a blizzard of hot embers, and then what felt like a bonfire was lit inside of Sam's chest. Sam let out a cry of surprise as the heat coursed through his body. The pursuing platoon of gargoyles screeched as they turned back into stone mid-flight and fell into the dark sea of trees that separated Quimbleys from the rest of Unity City. Sam sighed in relief, creating a billowing cloud from his hot breath on the crisp night. He continued gliding down to M Street and watched the stars. Standing atop Golden Dome Bank, adjacent to the alleyway he had emerged from earlier that evening, Sam surveyed the mostly dead M Street beneath him. The occasional person ran past on their journey to someplace hopefully safer, and at least 1 or 2 cars crept down the road at any given time. Sam was surprised to see so many functional cars, but he supposed anything was possible in the big city. Perhaps magic helped drive some of the machinery. In any event, the hot red Challenger hidden away in his alleyway wouldn't look too odd on M Street at this hour. Closing M's spellbook and tucking it away in his backpack, Sam prepared to glide down to the roof of the car. Just as he jumped, the clock decorating the face of the Golden Dome struck 1 a.m. and filled the air with deafening chimes. And thank goodness it did, because the spell that had allowed Sam to walk on air had lost its potency, and he slammed into the dumpster at full speed with a clamor. Not again, he thought as he heaved himself out of the garbage and then fumbled with the car door handle. It was unlocked. It had been quite a day, and thank goodness for small miracles. Sam had always been handy with machines, and the red Challenger bent to his will with just a little bit of coaxing and old-fashioned hot wiring. Throwing his backpack in the back seat, Sam made one final adjustment and the car roared to life. A full tank of gas, baby. I think I'll call you Lucy. Yeah, Sam said through a tired grin. The name had just popped into his head, and names like that just feel right. The dashboard was more modern than the chassis of the Challenger, which probably dated back to the 60s. Still, Lucy had seen better days. Neither the AC nor heater worked, and any attempt to tune into one of Unity City's various late-night radio shows was met with harsh static. Sam and Lucy rolled out of the alleyway and into the night. In order to actually leave Unity City, Sam had to drive Lucy over a darkened bridge at Quimbleys base. Looking back at it through his rear-view mirror, Sam found himself admiring just how beautiful it was basked in the starlight. The soft shimmer effect the Rainbow Wizard's sigil had on it didn't lessen the starlight's beauty. If anything, it enhanced it. That was until the spotlights appeared and tore open the sky. From the forest of Quimbleys, great beams of light illuminated the underside of the clouds that had gathered at the tip of the tower he had escaped from not half an hour before. And in these beams, dark figures flew and cast their own shadows on the cloud's underbelly. Gargoyles. Dozens of them. And other things, Sam realized. Other things he didn't recognize or dare to. They poured into the night and the stars began to blink. Sam put his foot hard on the gas and Lucy roared once more. It didn't even occur to Sam to think about how odd it was that the sentries weren't placed at the outskirts of the city, especially given the importance of what Unity City and Quimbleys represented to all of humanity. The truth of the matter was that the headcaster was quite right. There were very few creatures in all of existence who could get past the veil he put over the city. The power of his sigil was something to be reckoned with throughout the ages. Sam passed through the Rainbow Wizard's veil without noticing, and the blood-red spellbook in his backpack glowed blood red once more before going quiet for a very long time.